Hey, it's Drybear. And yes, the title is clickbait. Apologies for that one, but there is an important topic that I want to talk about today that is affecting the endgame for Diablo 4 and is something that I think the Blizzard team needs to decide at a high level how they want to handle this, and soon. And that is, what role should crowd control play in the endgame of Diablo 4? But first, you should come hang out with me on my live stream. I'm live every single day on twitch.tv/Drybear. If you don't come hang out with me and the community, then the next time you buy a shirt, when it finally arrives, it's going to be a slightly different color than you thought it was. It's still a color that you like, but it's not what you thought it was going to be. All right, let's get into the video. There is a very serious problem that exists in the end game of Diablo 4, and it revolves around crowd control. Not only the crowd control that can be applied to enemies that you're facing that will very quickly reach a diminishing return where they become crowd control immune, but also in the fact that all of the classes do not have an equal access to the CC immunity unstoppable. I think the two best classes that exist in the game right now, I would argue very strongly that Druid and Barbarian are both the two best classes for clearing Nightmare 100 and the Uber Lilith, or the Echo of Lilith encounter, are the two classes that have access to the most amount of unstoppable and also can make unstoppable last indefinitely if they build for it. Now let's look at this from a logical standpoint. Say you're developing a game, and I think the logic that was used here is actually quite sound. If you're making 5 different classes that have different toolkits available, if some of those classes have mostly ranged abilities, as well as a lot of utility that comes in the form of crowd control, or they can summon pets that can absorb blows for them, or they have ways to subvert aggro or avoid being hit, or even go stealth, you generally would want those classes to be more on the side of strategy. They have to utilize the strategy of activating their kit properly to navigate the combat scenario, and they would have less options for survivability and less options for immunity. And then if you have classes that, like the Barbarian, are meant to be primarily in melee range for most of their encounters, and the majority of their damage is done in melee range, it would make sense that you'd want to, from a design perspective, give that class more ways to thrive inside melee range, because otherwise they'll simply just be outclassed by ranged classes or classes with more utility. So I think when you're making a game, I think they made the right choice to give classes like Barbarian and Druid, when they go into shapeshifting, options to be crowd control immune, or to avoid it, or to stay in the melee range for longer periods of time. However, this theory starts to break down once you push past about Nightmare 50. Nightmare 50 to Nightmare 100, you run into many problems where CC becomes kind of untenable, and it becomes a very serious issue. So let's take this encounter that we have right here. This is a Nightmare 60, so it's not the highest in the game, but it represents my point, I think. Some mob types have a large amount of crowd control. As you start scaling higher and higher, you can see I'm level 86 here against level 114 mobs. That difference makes a lot of change in the amount of statuses that get applied to you and how easily they are to apply as well. And as the difficulty goes higher, their AI gets more aggressive and faster and more intense. So with this mob set here, this is one of those scenarios. This is Shadowed Plunge. We have this situation where we get the 2 fog gates that block us in, so we can't escape this room. We're trapped inside this room with these mobs, and we have to defeat them in order to move on. Unfortunately, this is the snake mob set, which what I would argue is in the top 3 for the worst mobs you could face in the game at any difficulty higher than 50 for several reasons. One is these big mobs, these big snake mobs, the spitters, not the smitters, but the big snake mobs here. They each have 2 hard stun mechanics. They have a melee attack, which they'll lurch back and strike forward. If you get hit by this, you get stunned. Anything over, I would say, like Nightmare 60 to 65, if you get CC'd, you're most likely going to die. Depends on your build, but in general, if you get hard CC'd and can't break it, you're probably just going to fall over dead. Not only that, but these mob types come with oracles, which will spawn after these big guys. The oracles will spawn the eyeballs, the Medusa eyeballs. You've seen these before. It summons an eyeball, and then it'll shoot out very quickly this forward cone that if you're in that cone, you instantly get stunned. So we have a problem here, because when we get high density of these mobs showing up, if you don't have high amounts of accessible unstoppable, it gets to the point where you just can't avoid the CC at a certain density level. It just comes out too fast. And then your option for characters, like you see right there, you just got hit by a CC. So we can run that back again. But if you're a character like a Sorceress, Sorceresses can break out of CC, but they can't prevent it as easily. Necromancers have the worst of it, where they just can't, they simply cannot avoid it. So you can see there's a stun there. Now I'm CC'd. The only option that Necromancer has for CC breaking is Blood Mist, which technically isn't a unstoppable, but it makes you immune and breaks, and it can be used when in CC, so it is in all effects a unstoppable. And you also have a boot that allows you to become unstoppable every 20 seconds at max roll, that allows you to avoid that. So in this situation, because the minions that we're facing hit a serious DR, then my only options for avoiding this, right? So I use Corpse Tendrils here, try and pull this in. This isn't a super meta build, by the way. I'm doing a Bloodlance build. This is probably a C tier build, but even so, my point stands. Your options for dealing with mobs as a Necromancer, a Rogue, and a Sorcerer or Sorceress primarily revolves around crowd controlling the enemies. So Corpse Tendrils, stunning with Shadow, things like that are how you prevent dangerous enemies like these from stun locking you over and over. However, the mobs will eventually, after maybe 2 applications, become immune to CCs, which means they can't be CC'd anymore. You don't have your unstoppable available anymore, and then you're eventually just going to die. There's nothing that you can do to stop it. There's too much CC going on, and again, if you get CC'd, you will die. So it reaches a point where you just can't progress through these unless you have unstoppable, and you can't CC the mobs to stop them from hitting you with CC. Now, let's not get ahead of ourselves here, because this is actually part of what makes ARPGs interesting for endgame, right? You want to have that RNG aspect and your class have strengths and weaknesses. That's why there's random affixes and random bonuses and random downsides. And there's certainly going to be builds that you make, depending on the class that you run, that will be unable to complete certain sigils just because of either the mob type, the location and the layout of the map, or the affixes that come with it. And I think that that is part of the fun and part of what makes the system interesting and why you want to constantly edit your build. However, the reason that I want to highlight this is because I think that at a high level, Blizzard needs to make a decision, and soon, on what role they want crowd control to play in the endgame of Diablo 4. If they like the way that it is right now, and that is when you get to high levels of CC with large spider packs that drop immobilizing roots all over the room that are hard to see, you have these snake packs which have the Medusa stun as well as the charge stun and the forward lunge stun from the large snakes. You have the Revenant packs that will do the forward stun as well. You have the large, the Dreadnoughts, the big armored golem dudes, the mech golem dudes. They have this frontal cone. When they slam on the ground, it will knock you back. Which means that if you get a high enough density of these large Dreadnoughts, you're going to be constantly knocked back and knocked back and knocked back and knocked back to the point where you can't even really cast anything or do anything unless you have Unstoppable to prevent this from happening. So if they like the way that it is now, with the density of the mobs that it gets to at higher levels, as well as the amount of CC that exists, I would argue that 3 of the classes, at least Rogue, Sorceress, and Necromancer, need to have more unstoppable options added to their kit if they want them to be on level with things like Barbarian and Druid, which can be unstoppable almost all of the time. Which means that they don't have to worry about that. They can focus on damage, they can reposition, they don't get caught out by random affixes and statuses because of the CC. Or if they think that the paradigm that exists now is what they want for the classes, then I would argue that they need to reduce the amount of crowd control that exists on the mob sets in Diablo 4 right now for endgame, and also subsequently reduce the amount of crowd control and unstoppable availability that exists for the classes that have a lot of it, because right now that economy is not well balanced between all the classes. And I can see it going both ways on whether they should do more CC immunity on the player side or less CC on the enemy side. They could even go the route of older Diablos where the diminishing returns on CC for enemies is significantly less, which means that, again, it's up to the strategic ranged utilitarian-based classes to manage that strategy as much as they can. But I think that right now, for classes that don't have a lot of unstoppable, if the enemies become CC immune after 2 applications of a CC, and you don't have an unstoppable that you can use more than once every 20 seconds, you just can't progress far enough into the game, and some mob sets just become completely unmanageable by the sheer fact that they have crowd control and nothing else. And I think that is something that is worth addressing and something that's worth talking about. But I want to know what you think. So let me know what you think down below in the comments. If you've been pushing Sorceress, Rogue, Barbarian, Necromancer, Druid, all of these to higher levels of endgame, what is your experience with the mob sets and the crowd control, and what do you think about this topic in general? If you enjoyed yourself today, leave a like down below. You can support me and my work on Patreon and view Patreon exclusive content, link in the description. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next one.